Hi, everyone. I'm here with Jens Notroff, a staff member for the German Archaeological Institute, and as well for 13 years with the Göbekli Tepe excavations. And so Göbekli Tepe seems to always be in the news, and it's something I certainly want to know more about. I've never been there. And so I really want to talk to him and learn more about this fascinating site. And so can you tell us about your history with the project? And also, I want to know what's your favorite thing about the site?
Oh, favorite thing. That sounds very, very, very cool. Yeah, first, thanks for inviting me to this discussion, Flint. I started working at Göbekli Tepe in 2006, still as a student back then, as a student assistant in the project, and somehow I stuck and then continued as a research assistant and spent quite a lot of time on the excavations itself and also in the whole analytical process which followed excavation. My favorite thing, that would be so much to unpick here, but I mean, there's these monuments, the cool monuments, and there's quite a lot of discussion of how it changed our understanding of the whole Neolithic transition. But for me, the most striking thing still is the subtle implications this site brings on the table. To build something like this, you need to coordinate workforce, you need to coordinate groups, bring together laborers and experts of quite different expertise. And this is something I find particularly fascinating, looking at the Neolithic at this time and thinking about a social structure allowing something like this to be built, to be organized. This is the most, for me, the most interesting and fascinating point about Göbekli Tepe, actually.
I think that's actually really fitting because that's also the point that I think brings up many of the fantastical claims in the media, right? So you get this idea that it's something that is, I don't know, ancient aliens or heck, I just saw an article that was a headline where there are images of dinosaurs on the pillars,
That too, yeah.
to the idea from Graham Hancock and others that there's sort of the survivors of a cataclysm that destroyed a lost advanced civilization came here with their advanced technology to do this. And so it's this kind of organization and skill that really intrigues a lot of people, right? What are some of the more fantastical claims that you've come across in your research or in your time engaging with the public or reading about the site?
Yeah, we get a lot of feedback actually, which is quite great because it's always quite interesting to get into this dialogue with the public and get all kinds of ideas we maybe don't even consider in our very specialized perspective on the site. But sometimes these ideas are really very, very yeah,
Interesting.
speculative would be maybe a kind word for this. So you mentioned the images of dinosaurs, which in fact the particular depictions referred to here are birds. Well, kind of dinosaurs if we consider that birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. But of course, it's birds, and I think the point here is that people have a fantastic idea and think, oh, that's fitting, but they are always looking for the most exciting explanation and not for the most simple or most logical ones. And in this case, it's birds, and we have a lot of bird bones on the site. So, and we have a lot of other bird depictions on the site. So, it's quite reasonable to think this is birds. But we have also all kinds of other much more spectacular interpretations suggested, like the site being an inventory of Noah's Ark with all the images put on lists, or even UFO landing areas, so that each of these enclosures somehow is an energy kind of battery recharging station or something like that for UFO. So there's all kind of well, spectacular interpretations, but the real archaeological data very, very rarely play a role in all of these discussions, to be honest.
But I imagine there must be a sort of feeling when you're at the site that it has a kind of energy, right? So there's something there about it that, I mean, I've never been there, but I've been to other archaeological sites that are pretty phenomenal. And so to some degree, I suppose there's an understanding there of sort of its antiquity, its importance, and the feeling one gets, and it's trying to put that into, I don't know, some sort of concept, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason we became archaeologists, because we find this stuff interesting. And if you are in a monumental site like this, and maybe even in the process of excavation, and you realize you're the very first person to see something carved in a stone for 10,000 years, of course, this does something with you. There is a kind of atmosphere and an aura to these places, for sure. But I think at the end of the day, we're still scientists enough to separate the emotional, exciting feeling from the interpretation of the site we're examining there. And it's quite interesting that you mentioned the atmosphere at the site, because I was lucky enough to experience it in very different states. In the very early state of excavation, where the pillars are still partly covered in soil, and where we slowly uncovered everything, and we were in these huge enclosures, monumental enclosures, under the open sky. And in the later period of the more recent excavations or analysis, there this protective shelter was constructed over the site, and the whole site, not only the singular enclosures, but the whole site has a totally different atmosphere to it once a roof was put upon these monuments. And this is also quite interesting, because this did at least help me get an idea, or get a feeling for the whole site, in terms of the discussion if there were roofs in prehistory as well, because the whole monuments, they appear completely different once they are underneath a roof.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's something that, being an archaeologist and staying sort of being embedded in a landscape and a site for over different seasons of the year, different years, which have obviously changes in weather patterns and what's going on, right, human wise. And then, yeah, the ways that you can uncover things and roof things. I've had the same experience at sites as well that I've worked at or been to long term. So that's a really good point. But let's step back for a second. And you mentioned sort of uncovering the site. And let's think about, I want to make sure that everybody understands sort of the chronology of the site and where it is. So do you mind just giving a quick intro to sort of what is Göbekli Tepe, right?
Intro, oh, that's a challenge. I'm trying to do my best. Okay, so the site is a pre-pottery Neolithic site, dating to the 10th and 9th millennium BC, basically. Pre-pottery Neolithic, in this case, means it's the part of the Neolithic, the younger Stone Age, where people did not yet develop pottery in terms of vessels. So there were some experiments with pottery for figurines and so on, but they did not use pottery vessels, which does not mean that they were drinking from their hands or so. They had just other material for vessels, bowls, and so on. Like, we know a lot of stone vessels, were probably wooden vessels and so on, made from animal hides. But they did not invent yet pottery vessels. It's still semi-nomadic kind of culture of hunter-gatherers. So we know that their subsistence was based on hunting. There was a lot of animal bones found on the site, all belonging to wild animals, to wild species. We also know the kind of semi-permanent settlements. These people were living mostly in the valleys, with a specific type of architecture. And that's a really interesting thing here. Almost all of these settlements have special communal buildings, which are a bit distinct from the usual settlement architecture. And these are buildings usually interpreted for communal or ritual purposes, for gatherings, meetings, rituals in a broader sense. And they resemble what we also have on the Göbekli Tepe, with benches along the walls, and with sometimes with pillars, even T-shaped pillars in some cases. And this led to the original interpretation of Göbekli Tepe, which was first noted in a survey report from the 1960s, but excavated from 1995 onwards by Klaus Schmidt from the German Archaeological Institute. And the first interpretation put it in in this yeah, ritual sphere, because these special purpose buildings, these communal buildings, were so striking, and it did not seem like an average settlement at that point.
Quick question. So these average settlements that from the same cultural group is what you're suggesting, right? Which cultural group is this from?
It's, well, it's not the Natufian. We are just a bit later. We're just at the end of the Natufian. There is actually no real comparable Natufian in this part of Turkey right now.
Okay.
It's basically the Prepottery Neolithic of Anatolia. So the sites I was referring to, or the most remarkable sites, would be Chayuni, for example, because there we have a whole sequence of architecture, of domestic settlement architecture.
And that's contemporary with Göbekli Tepe.
That's roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe. And the site of Nevali Chori is contemporary with the later phases of Göbekli Tepe as well. And this was the first site actually where T-shaped pillars were excavated at all.
Okay, so Göbekli Tepe was not the first one where they were found. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so you mentioned that the interpretations have sort of changed over time, where it was seen as this largely monumental ritual. What has changed on that? Is it changed?
Well, that's something totally natural, because further excavation broadens our material we can draw from, and of course broadens our interpretational frame and context. And in this case, after, I mean, about 25 years of excavation, meanwhile, it looks a bit more distinct. There are more structures than the original distinction between large circular structures and smaller rectangular structures, which were interpreted in terms of basically a chronological issue. But there are now, we know now, a lot of more structures, smaller circular structures all around as well. And it's still under discussion, it's still analyzed. But a picture is emerging right now that maybe there was much more happening than only these ritual purposes originally considered in the interpretation in the beginning. So we have these smaller structures hinting at maybe yeah, not, if not a permanent, then a longer habitation happening on site. We have a lot of stone tools hinting at wild cereal or nuts or other plant remain processing on site in a huge context, actually. So hundreds of saddle querns, for example, which were analyzed by a colleague of mine, hinting at communal plant processing at the site. So there's something more happening than just these huge monuments suggested in the very beginning.
That's really interesting, because this is something that I am interested in as somebody who studies food. And I think you as well as somebody who studies feasting. So I want to think about the sort of semi-permanent, permanent aspect and how archaeologists can tease that out. So sort of as an animal bone person, I've read Caroline Lang et al.'s sort of analysis of isotopes from sort of the gazelle bones, right? So gazelle, as far as I understand, is the most common animal remain at the site. And the sort of, if you look at the age structure of the herd, it looks like they're hunting this gazelle in the sort of summer to early autumn, right? Yeah. And then if you look at the isotope analysis from their teeth and bones, it looks like that matches up with when this herd naturally migrates into this sort of region, right? So there's a period of plenty. Now, what I'm curious on is the Laura Dietrich article that you're a co-author on there as well, on this sort of grinding of plant remains, right? So this is so can you tell me more about what that article tells us about sort of the gathering of plant resources, the processing of plant resources, and the seasonality sort of the site?
Yeah, I mean, the animal bones were always very prominent in the focus, because this is what you find. Lots and lots of animal bones, gazelle, aurochs. So it's easily to conclude, okay, they were hunters and they were feeding on wild animals, and apparently gazelle and aurochs played a big role in subsistence to supply the people maybe working on the site or meeting at the site. Yeah.
On that note, I remember that it was mentioned in the zooarchaeology publications that the aurochs also are slaughtered in the same season. So they're hunted in the late summer, early autumn type season.
Yeah. That definitely fits also the chronological picture. And what Laura was doing here, and which is really a fantastic approach and a quite innovative approach to just ask, okay, but what else rather when animals played a role in on the menu for these people, and because we have so many cell querns on site. Some are just used as a spolia in walls. Some are still in situ inside rooms. It's a huge amount of these tools, which are usually interpreted as a tool to process plant food. And so she was looking into.
So one second, just for the people who might be tuning in, saddle querns, they're going to be used for grinding plant remains. So you have one rock in a sense on a much larger one in which there's grain, and you'd be grinding it. It could be just to separate the seed from the spikelet that's holding it, or it could be to turn it into flour. There's all sorts of options for how it could be used, right? And so, yeah, keep telling us more. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
And the exciting thing here is that Laura put a very broad approach at the basis of her research. She was closely examining the corresponding finds from the site with microscopical analysis, with 3D scans to even get closer to the traces left on these stones. And she tried to replicate similar traces in a large series of experiments to just have an idea, okay, what kind of trace do nuts leave on the stones? What kind of traces does einkorn or other cereal remains leave in the stones? And so she found out that indeed a lot of plants were apparently processed at the site with the tools, and even that the tools, the same tools, were used to grind ochre to get the color. This typical red color also found in the filling of the site. So what Laura, in the end, to cut it really short, could show here with an exciting monograph, which is definitely recommended reading, is that apparently subsistence was also much broader than only the animal bones suggested. So it's not been hunters, it's hunter-gatherers, and they used they really used animals and plants wherever they could, and it all turned into an experiment in the end where we were even reproducing a kind of cereal gruel, which could be cooked with everything available at site, and going a step further, could be even fermented into a very basic form of beer.
Okay. And so these are wild, like, grains and cereals, right? So wild wheat.
So far, anything we could see in the material culture is wild plants and wild animals strictly. Of course, we're in the kind of a gray zone here if we're talking about managed and animal management and so. But yeah, it's not the domesticated species which become visible here.
Which, to be honest, is a long-term process that we have this.
It does take generation.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you can see the development of kind of domesticated grains, and they take time to, for example, to change morphologically in this region. And so we can see it step by step, meaning they weren't introduced from afar, right?
At Karachada, 60 or 80 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, or northeast of Göbekli Tepe, is one of the places where one of the origins of einkorn, this Neolithic founder crop, was pinpointed in genetic research.
Excellent. Yeah, and I mean, the whole region is the larger, broader region, in fact, is where we find the natural wild progenitors of emmer, einkorn, and different cereals like that. So they're available for sort of harvesting, let's say, and limited management. Okay, this is interesting. So one thing. Okay, so this must add to the seasonal picture because the harvest is going to be earlier than when the gazelle herds come through, right?
Basically, yeah, yeah,
The sort of
but
early
it just
summer time,
broadens the time frame.
in a sense.
Yeah,
So
but
we,
yeah, early.
yeah, and so what that suggests is that there's a glut of food available right here, wild food, right, kind of throughout the warmer months of the year, right? Um, which is definitely really interesting. Now these querns, are they associated with any specific types of structures at the site? Do we have a sense of living areas in some of these buildings?
I mean, as you said, it's not all excavated as of yet, so it's always a bit tricky to draw a general, broader picture. But so far, these querns are coming from all kinds of contexts. They are a part of older walls, reused as stones. They are found in situ in rooms of the younger phase of the site. There's a lot of those stones documented in the bottom area of these rectangular, apparently younger buildings surrounding the larger enclosures in the center. And there's a nice reconstruction drawing in I think it's in the paper you mentioned, where a lot of people can be seen sitting on the roofs of these rectangular buildings and grinding, doing a lot of grinding. So I would argue in the sense of this paper that they played a huge role probably in the whole history of the site, but we can maybe pinpoint a focus to these rectangular buildings as well, that there was something really huge happening in terms of communal grinding events, and this is exactly the point the article elaborates on.
Okay, so we sort of have this difference between these large circular structures with animals inscribed on them.
Yeah, it
And
might be an artificial difference as well, because what we see here, what we excavate with these monuments, is the last state of use only. So some of them seem cleared before were put out of use. So we don't know what happened before. So maybe the floors of these enclosures were covered in querns at some point in time, and they were just removed. So we really only can see the last state of use here. So this makes it a bit difficult, a bit different in terms of interpretation.
okay, but let's all make sure we clarify that for the audience because
Yeah.
some pseudo archaeologists, if you will sometimes use this sort of the fact that we're not always sure of things because we have the latest phase, right? And that means things might date much earlier and we can date it to any time we want. So I actually want to think about the chronology of the site, like in a little more depth, right?
Mhm.
So there's a series of different structures that come up that are dated at different periods of time. There's like an ordering of them in a sense. And while as far as I understand from the literature I've read, while initially the idea was that it was all filled in intentionally, there's now some thoughts that some of this is due to erosion, maybe slumping in soil to fill in these areas. So I want to talk about how do we actually date these structures if all we get is the latest remains on the floor. Have the excavations gone underneath the structures to sediment that's underneath to be able to get dates and put a sandwich in a sense? You have the latest phase, you have what's going on earlier, or is there some overlap architecturally between structures that can tell us about relative chronology? How is the order of construction and the chronology done? If you want to give a couple of examples, that would be great.
To also make it, I'm trying to make it really short and pointed. In the original structure of the site, the original working sequence, if you would like to put it like this, is that the rectangular larger monumental structures were the earliest phase, dating to the earlier Prepottery Neolithic.
Which
and then,
enclosures are these?
pardon?
Which enclosures are those? Or which
the ones right behind you, A to D, in the so-called
okay.
main excavation area, these large circular enclosures.
So these are the earliest.
But adjacent to them were always these somehow smaller rectangular buildings, which also produce T-pillars, but also smaller T-pillars, while in these large enclosures, they reach up to 5 meters. In the smaller rectangular buildings, they are maybe 2 meters high, even smaller. And the first idea to create this sequence came actually from the archaeological record, from analogies we do know. So I already mentioned Nivalichori, where T-shaped pillars were excavated for the very first time, and where we only have these rectangular buildings with smaller T-shaped pillars. So the dates from Nivalichori were put as an analogy for these rectangular buildings at Göbekli Tepe.
So this is a stylistic analogy.
It's yeah, the typical archaeological stylistic comparison.
Yeah.
But these larger enclosures, they did not fit into these pictures. So they are much more monumental, much larger. They are circular rather than rectangular. And this is another phenomenon we know from the Neolithic of the wider region, that the older buildings are circular or in this oval shape, and then over time the rectangular buildings are appearing. So this structure, this relative chronological structure, that the rectangular buildings must be a bit younger and the circular older, derives from this comparison.
Okay.
And we can add the actual material we find there on the side. So the typical stone tools, which are partly in the filling, but we are also in the lucky situation that we know the quarries and the workshop areas where these pillars were created. Okay. And there some tools were lying around. And from these tools, so typical flint tools, other stone tools, from these tools we can also draw conclusions, because we know the material culture of the wider region as well, and arrive also at the pre-pottery Neolithic if we compare the typical stone tools found at Göbekli Tepe with stone tools from other sites in the area. And add to this scientific dating methods like radiocarbon dating, for example, which did not quite well work with the bones, because the preservation of the bones was not good enough to come to satisfying conclusive results dating these bones. But we are lucky to get some charcoal from the wall plaster, for example, from one of the largest enclosures, enclosure D or building D, where some charcoal was inside the wall plaster and inside the mortar of the walls. Mm-hmm. And these could be dated, and these also confirm the pre-pottery Neolithic date, which we arrived by the other dating methods. So that said, we can say very clearly that in this enclosure, the wall was, at least last time the wall was plastered, was this time we can put our finger on these radiocarbon dates. Okay, and so all of this then would confirm that the larger structures are earlier than the smaller ones, or this is still a work in progress, because a huge radiocarbon series is still under analysis to put all these rectangular structures, and even more interestingly, all these other smaller circular structures all around, into this bigger picture. But this is, I mean, it's a rather young excavation. 25 years is nothing. At Troy, we're excavating for over 100 years. So it's something we can look forward to in the future. There is a lot of more data coming, I'm sure. But this is the working hypothesis we're still working with right now. Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. It also explains why, for example, Graham Hancock starts to talk about this introduction of technology, where it seems to appear out of nowhere, as he claims it, these monumental large stone megalithic structures, right? So I'm wondering how, since I have to go up and talk with Graham at some point, how would you address that kind of claim, knowing the archaeology of the region? Do these large megaliths appear out of nowhere? Or how is there other structures before these megaliths in the region or not? How do you go about approaching that? I mean, no Neolithic hunter wakes up one morning and says, "Hey, let's build some 5.5 meter high T-shaped pillar. That should be cool." I mean, if you put something up like this, where there needs to be a kind of process of a development process, an idea to come up with something like this. And I think the basic thinking behind this still is very much tied to the earlier days of excavations at Göbekli Tepe, or at the perception of the archaeology at Göbekli Tepe, where the site appeared to be a rather exceptional, a singular phenomenon in a vacuum, which actually never was true. It never was a cultural vacuum around the site of Göbekli Tepe, because it was set into the pre-Pottery Neolithic of the region. And as I said, T-shaped pillars were already known since the excavations at Nevallichori in the 1980s, which was the reason why Klaus Schmidt in the beginning at all recognized them at Göbekli Tepe, because he was working at Nevallichori. So while Nevallichori apparently is a bit younger than Göbekli Tepe, so Göbekli Tepe is the older site, we see that there is a development with these T-shaped pillars. But there are also other sites in the surroundings, and luckily a lot of them are now under excavation. So we now see a much broader picture of many other sites with T-shaped pillars, some bringing up even older dates, as of yet, as it seems, like Karahan Tepe, for example, or Bonchuklu Tarla. Also sites belonging to this wider cultural phenomenon. And even if the pillars or the stone structures are not in all of these places characteristically T-shaped, there are regional local variants. Sometimes it's just a stele without the T-head. Sometimes they appear to be thinner or broader. But the general concept behind them is comparable, and it's becoming clear that they are belonging to a larger cultural complex. And what I want to say with this is that we see a development here, and I'm pretty sure there are older sites, and that the stone working technique visible at Göbekli Tepe, for example, with these T-shaped pillars, was developed in other materials first. We know the spectacular wood carving for this so-called idol from Siberia, from Shigir, which is a rare example of preserved wood, and even if it's geographical, totally out of the realm of suitable analogies for Göbekli Tepe, but it shows that woodworking techniques are very similar to what we see here at Göbekli Tepe. So I'm sure
you have a proxy, right? You have worked bone, right? Which is a good proxy for wood. And
exactly. So it's totally possible and probable even that we have to think about predecessors just made from material not preserved to us. So that's the whole point. We know one state of this technique worked in stone, but it does not mean that this is the very beginning of this kind of technology.
And there's a whole lot of evidence out there from like you said, there's other more monumental enclosure sites, but you also mentioned earlier that in the lowlands and the settlements, the other semi-permanent settlements, there's also large sort of communal monumental structures, which occasionally include similar stones, megaliths. And so it's part of a much larger cultural package that we have in this specific small region even. And so, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's that context and that seasonal context, lowlands, uplands, each fulfilling a different aspect of this culture in different seasons of the year, that I think helps tie it together. That's good. I like that. And these quarries, therefore, are also very local. It's not like they had to drag the stone hundreds of miles or something like that.
Oh no, it's more like hundreds of meters, 300 meters or so. You can see the quarries from Göbekli Tepe actually. So it's just the surrounding rock plateau.
Okay. Do you think you and me could move one of the stones together?
I doubt. I don't know about your physical fitness, but I know mine, and I doubt it. No, there were experiments going on, and it showed that it's quite some effort to move these stones.
Of course, no. There's lots of experiments that have shown how people could move giant stones. If you have enough people and enough sort of practice and know-how, it's very
Yeah.
doable to do without any.
A couple of students could do this, and I'm not, I don't remember the maths exactly, but the colleague doing this experiment just said, okay, maybe two students equal one fit hunter or something like that. So it's
These sort of animal reliefs, right? And I know that you've on social media and the blog the Tepe telegrams, which I hope everybody goes to and checks out. That you've done a lot on these sort of animal diagrams and tried to explain to the public the context of them. So can you help fill us in on sort of what is the context of these animal diagrams? What do they represent? How does the team in general? What's the team's interpretation of them?
so it's quite amazing because these animal carvings are adorning a lot of these pillars. Not all. There are also some pillars without any carving or without any animal carvings, but it's the variety of animals which is so interesting. I mean, in the beginning, you find a gazelle or a fox or boars are also quite prominently displayed in the reliefs and in sculptures. And you say, yeah, okay, that's their natural environment. They are hunters, so they are depicting the hunted game here. That makes totally sense. And it's quite amazing because these reliefs really demonstrate the close observing of these animals. They are so naturalistic that our zoologists in the team can really pinpoint species, and sometimes they point out some characteristic trait and say, yeah, of course, that's totally clear. I didn't recognize it in the beginning. But the more striking thing is that the closer you look and the more animals came up during excavation, it was not that clear anymore that they are just depicting the hunted animals where they had around them. At some point, it even turned out that, at least in my impression, or maybe I have to recount all the singular images to clarify this, that a lot of the carvings rather represent what I would call nasty animals. So there's a lot of snakes, there are scorpions, there are spiders. So this is not the typical hunting spectrum you would suspect from a hunter just putting up an inventory of all the cool stuff they hunt to eat. So there's something more going on than just depicting their environments. And it turns out that upon closer inspection, even the typical hunting spectrum is depicted in a very specific way. So we have these boars, which are always showing bared teeth. We have foxes, which are appearing to be leaping, which is typical hunting behavior for foxes. And there's, in general, an atmosphere of snarling predators, of leaping leopards. So it's a very dynamic and a very threatening atmosphere, at least in our understanding. Of course, this is interpretation. I cannot say that a Neolithic hunter had the same impression of these animals, but it seems a very threatening atmosphere inside these enclosures, looking at these images. And now, if we are remembering that the atmosphere in these monuments was totally different once a roof was put on them, it turned quite interesting that being down there in darkness at night or with a roof upon them, just in the flickering light of a torch with jumping shadows, and then you have these snarling predators. This must have been a very, very particular atmosphere inside these enclosures. In particular, considering that the very few pathways we know inside the site seem to be constructed in a way with a lot of curves and angles going on that you did not know what would expect you inside once you started entering. And just imagine being a young hunter, maybe in some kind of initial ritual or something, sent down there with a torch or a candle or something, and all the other hunters standing outside and maybe making some noises or so. It must have been quite a threatening atmosphere, I can imagine.
How do you reconcile, though, having more peaceful creatures at the same time? Because there's gazelle and different birds and things like that. Are they in different locations, or
Mhm.
are they sort of all mingled together, these different wild animals?
Gazelles are really rare compared to the other
Okay.
animals, and maybe they play a role in hunting depiction as well. So there are also some kind of hunting depicted here. The birds are in a different chapter. There are these long-legged birds, like cranes, for example, which appear on quite a lot of reliefs, which might be related to some kind of ritual background, because the crane images are very, very popular among the Prepottery Neolithic of the region. There are a lot of crane depictions known from other sites, and we even argued that this maybe even hints at some kind of ritual costuming, because from Çatalhöyük, another slightly younger site, there were remains of a crane bone discovered, which hints at the existence of a crane costume. And there, some of the depictions at Göbekli Tepe also look rather strange anatomically. If you look at the leg anatomy of the birds, which might be hinting at yeah, costumes or masked people, but the other birds very visible on the sides are often vultures. So very characteristically with the beaked,
Mm-hmm.
with the beak and the collar. And vultures, and in this case, pillar 43 is the very prominent example with
Yeah,
the
let me show that really quickly.
yeah.
This is off of Martin Sweatman's website, just because I figure if we're gonna share an image, we should show the one that he uses. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do it. Yeah, this is the upper part of the image, and there you see the vulture.
Yeah.
It's in my opinion, it's very clearly recognizable as a vulture with the collar and the beak. And on the lower part of the same pillar, there is a headless body, a human body seen, and this is something we often find these vulture depictions also at other sites. They are often associated with either headless bodies or separated heads. And maybe the circle and on top of the vultures on the tip of the wing here is also representing a head or something. So this is something linking dead bodies, apparently dead bodies, and vultures closer to another. And of course, this is a characteristic we know from vultures as well. They are necrophagous birds. They are necrophagous
Yeah.
animals.
And so that's interesting. So there's this idea that this is a very special image that is unique and points to a specific cosmological date, right? But what you're telling me is that not only at the site does it have a context of lots of different vultures throughout the site, but throughout the larger region, there's lots of similar depictions of vultures.
Yeah, I mean the vulture images from the site are countable on one hand, but in the whole iconographic context of the pre-pottery Neolithic, the vulture is something of an almost typical animal depicted in this kind of context, and in particular in this kind of context related to dead bodies or headless bodies or separated heads. This is something we can almost call kind of a topos in pre-pottery Neolithic iconography.
But they don't that makes a lot of sense, and I think that that's sort of the key, is to understand the context here, right? Okay, good. That was one of my really important questions for you, because I wanted to know how am I going to answer that.
Yeah, no,
um
I mean, there's if you just for a quick minute go back to iconography in general,
yeah, for sure.
it's not exceptional either at Göbekli Tepe. We have these vulture depictions, we have these snakes, we have a lot of different animals. And the thing here is that we know very similar, almost typologically similar depictions like these from a lot of other sites in the
Yeah.
surroundings, not only in the closer vicinity of Göbekli Tepe, but up to 200 kilometers around the site. So this is something very, very typical for the pre-pottery Neolithic. This is a characteristic which helps us defining the culture of the pre-pottery Neolithic. And to just cherry pick a couple of few images from Göbekli Tepe without considering this wider context of the whole culture is very, well, it's dishonest actually, because it just just ignores the fact that there's a whole culture around these images, and they are not necessarily only related to the very medium they are now depicted on at this specific site.
I prefer not to go so far as to say dishonest. I think it could also just be from a lack of understanding how
Yes, of course.
archaeologists use and understand context. And I think that's really important. So you mentioned that there's very similar iconography at local sites and further away, but only, within the region, right? Within this region, which has, sort of similar phenomenon going on. The pre-pottery Neolithic and harvesting wild grains and hunting gazelle. It's all part of this larger package of how people are living. Package might not be the right word, but it's all part of how people are living. And so
I would call it a package, actually. I mean, we now went we don't like the term of Neolithic revolution anymore. I mean, Child coined it, and it's a very, very fancy term, and it's a good term, but it implies that there's something quickly happening. The revolution is something which happens. And while the outcome was revolutionary for all the people, who for us as well, our basically our style of living today is a result of this Neolithic revolution, but it was not a quick event for the people involved directly. So we really prefer to call it a Neolithic package, which was created at that time, which is quite fitting, actually.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's important to recognize how this is a process rather than an event, rather than an invention. Even it's not an invention of agriculture or of architecture. This is a process of one thing that in different places it's happening differently as well. But I do want to go back to the iconography really quickly. So this similar iconography in the local and then larger region, is this all carvings on stone, or is it a variety of different media? What are you talking about here?
It is basically carved on stone, but within this medium on a variety of objects. So we have these T-shaped pillars, the monuments with images, and we also have very small stone plaquettes, just not bigger than your hand, even smaller, with the very same iconography. And they don't even seem to have another purpose than holding these images. And you have very practical images, very practical objects like shaft straighteners, also adorned with the very same images. The very same snakes and birds are appearing on this.
Wait, what was that object?
A shaft straightener, to put an arrow shaft to get it straight.
An arrow shaft straightener. Okay, cool. Yeah.
And in this context, it even makes sense to have a bird and a snake on this kind of objects, because from an ritualistic understanding, it makes sense if you would like to load your arrow with the speed of a bird or the poisonous of a snake. So I can see why it is fitting to these objects. But then again, we have these stone plaquettes with same object, same iconography, which really are only there as a medium to carry these objects, which is quite interesting in a communicational kind of understanding.
So you have a lot of humans in the pre-pottery Neolithic, is what you're saying.
It changes, there's a lot of more humans, and if we understand these T-shaped pillars as anthropomorphic, as human-like depictions, which they are due to the hands and belts and so on depicted on them, when you now have animals projected onto humans or human-like beings. So this is in my opinion, this is somehow transporting a shifting understanding of our role in nature, that humans somehow started to redefine their own role in this whole natural environment.
Wait, I want to delve in for a second on one of those points, the sort of anthropomorphism of the pillars themselves. So do you see that now?
Yeah, this is a quite good example, and this is what really helped understanding me to get the idea. Okay, these are human-like beings, because I had really difficulties recognizing this in the beginning. From Nivali-Chori, there were also some stylized arms known, and so the idea, Klaus Schmidt was also very keen on explaining to us whenever he could, these are human-like beings. This is an anthropomorphic sculpture, and to be honest, I couldn't see it. I had no idea. And the fun thing is, the pillar depicted here, when I started excavating there, it was just the head was excavated, or upper part of these arms. So no way I could see a human being.
So we're looking at this in a sense from the side. This would be the right arm.
Exactly.
This would be the side of the head. This would be, I guess, I don't know if people can see my mouse, but we're looking at it from the side. Okay, I see what you're saying.
And in the course of excavation, these arms appeared, these hands appeared, even the belt and a loincloth hanging down from the belt appeared. So yeah, finally, even I understood, okay, this is something anthropomorphic. This is, I'm not sure if it's a human because it's 5.5 meters high, which is quite monumental, and we know life-sized human sculptures as well. And the interesting thing here is also the abstract shape. I mean, the T-pillars, maybe they are owed to the material because the local limestone appears banked geologically. So it would be really easy to just extract a bank of limestone and you have already this rectangular shape, and then you start working out this monument. But they have no faces, which is quite interestingly. The anthropomorphic, the human-like, the natural sculptures, life-size sculptures, they do have faces. But here we're faceless, and this is quite interesting in terms of depiction, because it seems to be an intention here compared to these other sculptures.
Do most of them? Do some of them? How many of them have hands like this?
Not all of them. A minority actually.
Okay.
It's the central pillars. These stone circles are a couple of T-shaped pillars standing in a circle at the walls, but there's one pair in the center, and in particular in enclosure D, the biggest one, the center pair is characterized by these arms and loincloths. There are some other pillars which also have arms or had arms where the image is erased, but they are standing sometimes even the wrong way around in the circle, which is quite interesting, because this is something we also need to mention, hinting at constant rearrangement and reconstruction going on at the site. So as I said, what we see is the last state of architecture there. But a lot of these pillars seem to be reused in a totally different context. There are images erased. Some are like the one with the arms turned the other way around. So there is a lot going on rearrangement, and this makes it, in my opinion, very difficult to use images on particular pillars as a chronological pointer, as a remembrance of a specific date, like in this whole comet discussion appeared, because we just don't know if the very same pillars did not appear in a very, very different context a couple of years earlier.
That makes sense. So, okay, that actually leads me to another question I got for you as I think about how to discuss this with Graham Hancock. So he argues that there's a relative chronology, I think, for enclosures A through D, and that they have this orientation that he can use to date their construction. Okay. So from what you were telling me, it sounds like there's just in general, a date that larger enclosures are earlier than some of the later smaller structures. But is there a clear relative chronology between these different large enclosures?
There is one we might come up with in more detailed studies of the intersectional areas, which are not in all cases excavated as of yet, because of the very same reason. It's this very, very challenging understanding to analyze this, and we really do want to do this in a very careful and a very structured way. So this is why these hotspots are examined very closely, and this takes time. So this will finally come up, I'm pretty sure, and already did come up with very much more detailed internal chronology, which is still discussed in the scientific community on conferences and so on. But there's work going on to answer exactly this question. But it's difficult to address this due to the fact that they rearranged so much on the site, that they rebuilt, they added walls, they removed walls, they added pillars, they removed pillars. So there's a lot of stuff going on during the Neolithic there. So that I think it's really not easy or not possible at all to say that the context of a certain pillar and a certain image we know today is the original context it has always been in during the time of the
so site. In a sense, this is a very complex archaeological site, like everyone I've ever worked on as well. But what you're also saying is there is no clear consensus on the order of those four
Yeah,
enclosures.
I mean, it's that's that's what I like about science actually and research. That you come up with suggestions, you come up trying to prove your theory in the archaeological record, which turns out quite difficult in terms of stratigraphy here. And we have other colleagues who have a great expertise in, for example, how building structures are developing oversight, and they come up with very good ideas and try to prove them in the stratigraphy in the material record, and then you just sit in a table and try to make something of it. This is the great thing about research and science, but this takes time, and this is in this case something still very much on the table, I would say. But I really like to put back and forth these ideas and yeah, thinking loudly thinking about this kind of stuff.
This makes a lot of sense. Okay, what about the orientations of the enclosures? That's another key factor of his argument. Is there like a clear entrance to them? I remember in Ancient Apocalypse, he showed these orientations with a clear line coming out of each of them. Are there clear entrances to these enclosures that could suggest they're pointing in a certain direction?
Not really. There's one entrance situation in this building C, but this is the entrance situation I was describing with a lot of angles and curves where you have no idea what is expecting you inside. But it's totally unclear how this, to which point in time of this specific enclosure the entrance is related to, because in particular, building C was remodeled so often. There are several rings of pillars and walls inside this building. And this is the only situation where we have a clear entrance situation, roughly coming from somewhere in southeast towards the center of the enclosure, ending actually, at least in the state we've excavated these days, ending at a wall. So there's a wall, and you cannot just move on into the enclosure because the whole path is blocked. So it seems to be an older path. In other cases, there are what we still discuss as kind of porthole stones. Huge stone, huge is quite often exaggeration. You have to squeeze yourself through them, but they are interpreted as possible entrance areas, but they are not in situ as well. They're just somewhere in the filling of these enclosures. So it's still open to discussion if they maybe were entered from above, like we know from a lot of other buildings in this period, that the entrances were in the roofs actually. But clear entrance situations would be really an exception, in my opinion, as would be a total clear orientation. I mean, if you're looking at our excavation plans, they are roughly oriented to the central pillars, if we just look at them, roughly oriented towards south, but there's no clear north-south orientation visible. No.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense geographically, actually, because we are on a hilltop here, and you're looking down into a valley, into a plain, which is south of the hill. So having the monuments looking into the plain makes sense somehow.
You preempted my exact question. I was going to ask, how does the local topography how is that reflected in not the orientation, in the layout of these structures? So they're kind of, in a sense, looking down into the valley. Any other aspects that you can think of about how the topography influences the layout of the site?
I mean, it's on top of a mountain, so it's also quite an exaggerated point. And there are different small summits, if you would like to put it like this. And this is where specific structures can be found. But the so-called main excavation area, which is basically the part seen behind you on the image, is in kind of a shallow in this. We have to put it like an artificial mound because it was growing over time due to filling events, and this is what actually gave the name its modern the site its modern name. Göbekli Tepe means mound with a pot belly, and due to the small summits and this shallow in the middle, it looks kind of a navel, if you would like. Yeah.
Okay, another navel. All right, so the next idea, as far as I understand Hancock's argument, is that he suggests, just as you mentioned, there's this relative chronology where there's the larger structures with larger T-shaped megaliths. And then later on, there's this, as he puts it, a decline to these smaller ones. And I'm wondering, are these smaller ones more crudely made? Is the iconography more crude? What makes it, why would he argue that it's a decline other than just a change in size? Is there anything that you could think of that would suggest that these people were still as sophisticated in this next phase?
I think the notion of a decline here really only comes from size. So where the buildings get smaller, the pillars get smaller, and the number of pillars is reduced as well.
Okay.
But there's no technologically or artistically decline. I mean, they are not adorned with a lot of animals anymore, but some of the greatest depictions of these jumping leopards, leaping leopards, for example, are coming from one of the smaller buildings. I wouldn't say, no, I really wouldn't agree that this is reflecting a certain decline. Quite the other way around. If you are now managing to put a very complex concept like a monument of the size of these circular enclosures into a smaller room without the need to put all these symbols, and you still get the message through, which is an advancement in my opinion. Personally, I think that maybe a change of social structure could be a reason to orient towards smaller rooms, that family clusters are now playing a more important role, for example. But technically, there's no reason to equal size or smaller size with a technological decline. Just look at our telephones, for example. My actual phone is much smaller than the one I used a couple of years ago.
That makes a lot of sense. And then were the larger enclosures still being modified and used at the same time that these smaller structures were built?
That's the tricky question, and I wish I could answer this, but this is really part of the overall discussion. There are some hints that there still was knowledge about these larger enclosures when the rectangular buildings were built, because they are sparing the very same area where the larger monuments are. So all the rectangular buildings are adjacent to the pit, to the shallow where the large monuments are. So they knew there is something. They did not build on top of them, and there even is a terrace wall running around all of the area where the larger enclosures are, which seems to be contemporary with the rectangular buildings. So it seems likely, in my opinion, that they were partly backfilled at this point in time, and that maybe the tops of the pillar heads were still sticking out of the filling, for example, which also would be a great explanation for the addition of these cup marks we see on top of the pillage, which might have been developed in exactly this time. There seems a visible relation to between both layers. Yeah.
Okay, so that leads to my next question, which is the filling in of these larger enclosures. And I know from talking to you beforehand that that's complicated, and I just want to tell you what my perspective is really quickly. Well, first, Graham Hancock mentions that I guess Klaus Schmidt told him that they were intentionally filled in a single event. And that's why they're full of cobblestones and things like that. But from my recent reading to prep for this, in both a 2020 report by Lee Clare and in the Laura Dietrich article, there's mentions that there's evidence for sort of a natural erosional process that is filling this in. And in particular, in the Dietrich article, it's argued that's why there's so few archaeobotanical remains, because that process broke them up. But we know there's lots of grains there because we have the phytoliths, right? Which are these tiny microscopic things that are made of silica and are not going to break up. And so in a sense, and then you just mentioned this terrace wall around it. It could be that they're even trying to slow or stop this infill. So can you tell me more about the current perspective on the sort of filling in of these enclosures in terms of how it happened, chronology of how it happened as best as you can? Sorry, one last detail I remember reading is that this fill included a combination, a mixed group of both pre-pottery Neolithic A and B stuff, suggesting a long-term process. So correct me where I'm wrong, please, and tell me what you think the current interpretation, as far as you know, is from the team for the filling of this.
It's a complicated mess, to be honest. No, stratigraphy never is an easy thing, and in this site in particular, it's a dream of each archaeologist, or a nightmare, depending on whom you are asking. The thing here is that we are not dealing with what we typically have in excavations, with these nicely layered sediments which were accumulated over time, and which we can so nicely, often not always nicely, recognize in a nice clean profile. And when we can put our trowel on the layers and say, yeah, this is where the next layer starts. So what we have here is basically a filling of rubble mixed with other rubble, mixed with more rubble, and some stone tools and animal bones.
So lots of rubble.
Yeah, a lot of rubble. And the idea that backfilling was part of the construction process, so that they never meant to stand open for a long time, was an idea Klaus was toying around with in the beginning, because there are some historical analogies that symbolic arenas, for example, are only are constructed and then backfilled to just pretend profane use of sacred areas. This was an idea he was toying around with, but he was never strictly saying this is the only interpretation possible, and this is a one-time effect. Because already in the course of excavations, it became visible that there were different events visible in the backfilling, although it looked rather heterogeneous due to all this rubble filling. What now, after much closer inspection and discussion of stratigraphy, which is still ongoing, as everything in this site at the moment, seems indeed to suggest that we have much larger complexity of backfilling events here as well, which includes intentional backfilling, as well as natural processes like erosion or destruction processes where walls were falling down with the enclosures, and maybe just cleaned, and then the enclosures were still reused at this level, when half filled in level. There are walls and buildings, in particular in the upper part of the mound, these rectangular buildings, which hint at reparation going on after maybe earthquakes or some other sliding events, landslide events, which left some destruction and left some of these enclosures backfilled. But it's definitely, as the current picture looks, it's definitely not a one-time event. This is something happening over time. People were returning to the site, we're finding some destruction, we're repairing the destruction, we're reusing the pillars, or rebuilding the pillars, where maybe using the same enclosure in just different states. But it's definitely something happening over a longer time. So this is something, there's a longer biography to these buildings. How long is difficult to address, in my opinion. You mentioned the PPNA, PPNB material in the filling, which is an indicator that there is something going on for quite some long time. But on the other hand, we have to keep in mind that some of the maybe artificial backfilling processes, of course, needed some material to fill in there. Mm-hmm. So they just could have used something lying around for quite some long time to put it in there at some point in time.
Okay. Very interesting. So basically, it's complicated, which is how archaeology is. I think that that's a key point to make, is the archaeological record is fragmented. It is reused, these spaces and these structures, and this is common of pretty much every archaeological site, right? And so one of the things that I firmly believe in is that we should be asking questions that our evidence is suited to answer, right? And so in that sense, I kind of want to return to some of your ideas that you've published on kind of feasting and cultic activity, and sort of, well, at least from my perspective, that to me strikes me as something that's more secure, because you have all this clear evidence of sort of food and drink and stuff like that, rather than understanding the reuse of these spaces and stuff like that, where things are quite complex. And so I was wondering if you could tell me how you envision the kind of feasting that takes place at Göbekli Tepe.
The general idea behind this is that we assume the purpose of the site, because you're not just going into the mountains one happy Sunday morning thinking, hey, today I raise some monuments because I've got nothing else to do. There seems to be, there is an intention behind these monuments. There's a reason for these monuments. And looking into the general cultural structure of the period we're talking about, so about semi-nomadic hunter groups, comparably small hunter groups, but a lot of them dispersed over the wider area, brings up the idea that we maybe need to look into history or anthropology, social anthropology, ethnography, to get an idea what are these groups doing. And one thing which quite often occurs is that they meet occasionally at certain places. So this is something very typically that mobile groups need meetings at certain points in time just to exchange information. What happened in the next valley? Is there something we should know? They exchange material goods. The greatest, newest obsidian pieces, because there's another tribe or group living much closer to a volcano where we have the material at hand and can change their latest obsidian arrowheads with something else the other group can provide. And of course, marriage partners. So this is something to just have keep the gene pool fresh of the group. So this is something happening occasionally in historic and ethnographic sources we know of. And this is something we can easily envision for the Neolithic as well, because this is some kind of a natural process which is immanent to these cultures. And the interesting thing now about these historic analogies is that these meetings occur in the frame of feasts, of large feasts, because of course you need some kind of a framework if you want people to come together, and the feast is always a good point to attract people. And at some points we found that these meeting places seem to be fixed, so they were always meeting at the same places because at some point they're established, and each half a year or whatever, the tribes are meeting at a certain point in the landscape, and they start even marking these points with monuments to make it even more recognizable. The thing about Göbekli Tepe is that it is a kind of a landmark. It may not be the highest mountain in the region, but from the Haran plain in the south, it is visible. So it is something you can point and say, we meet up there. And the building activity itself is a communal process, which also turns out to be an essential asset in the creation of a cultural identity for a group, but also for a creation of social cohesion within the group, because these communal cooperative projects are something which fuel the social cohesion in a group, but also within these different groups, because to create such a monument, you probably need more hands than a single hunter group can provide. So this is a good reason to bring together several groups from different areas to have something to work on together, to create a common identity, an identity we actually can see in terms of iconography, as I pointed out earlier. So the idea is that Göbekli Tepe is some kind of a social hub where different groups met, engaged in cooperative projects, and used this opportunity for all kinds of ritual activity like exchange of information, marriage partners, initiation rituals for hunters, and so on. The problem at hand here is if you've got so many people there, you need to feed them. And while it is a nice landmark, it's not exactly the best spot to catch up water, to have the animals around, because the animals are passing through the valley. They are not going over the mountains. So you need to provide food at some point to these large feasts. And we know that they ate aurochs, gazelles. We discussed this because we found lots of animal bones in the filling. Disclaimer, as I said just a couple of minutes ago, the filling might have been accumulated somewhere else in the surroundings and then filled in at a later point, but still it must have come from somewhere.
Local though, yeah.
Yeah, must have come from. And we know that the food was brought up there specifically for these purposes, because I mean, a gazelle is easily carried around the shoulders. But try this with an aurochs, no chance. So we only found the bones of the meaty part of the aurochs. So we brought it up there. There are no aurochs heads, for example. It's no skulls. Okay. So it was already the bone material hints at large scale feasting. Then we have these plant processing evidence. We talked about Laura's research, and we have these huge stone vessels at the site as well. I think with a capacity of up to 160 liters. So also providing much more content than a single person or so would use up there living up at the mountain. So all this put together is, in my opinion, a good argument for feasting on the site in terms of these construction activity, so-called work feasts, as they are called in historical and ethnographic sources.
So wait, what are you thinking those large stone vessels, 160 liters, were? What was in them? Any ideas?
It's a kind of difficult question. Where water would be an easy answer, because we found also hints at rain collection systems on. Because it's not quite clear if there really was a water source up there. And the Neolithic is a very small river, muddy river today, but it's not quite clear how water situation was there in the Neolithic. But rain collection definitely played a role. Interestingly, some of these large stone vessels had a grayish appearance in the interior, and of course we sampled it. And there was some hint at oxalate having built up in these vessels, which typically develops during fermentation of cereals, for example. It also develops with other plants. Rhubarb is one, I think, and spinach as well. But given the whole context of plant processing with einkorn and so on, it seems at least plausible to argue that there was some kind of fermentation of cereals going on in these vessels, which could happen naturally if you just forget your gruel or porridge a day too long in the sun, and then something just happens. Or it just might hint at a very intentional process of early beer brewing. We recreated this experimentally. It's possible, even without adding yeast or hops or something. So the result is it's a very refreshing, but with very low alcohol, a very kind of refreshing beer-like drink, very low alcohol, which is very variety of reasons. It's an improvement over water. It tastes better, for example, but it's also more durable to be stored up there in water. And it quite interesting, something I just read up on is that the fermentation process also, I'm not an expert in plant processing, but the fermentation process also somehow degrades the proteins in the cereal.
Celiac disease. Okay, so yeah, it helps people be able to consume grain.
And this is something which the fermentation process actually speeds up the degradation of these proteins already.
Okay, this is interesting. Yeah. So in a sense,
a couple of arguments.
What I'm hearing from you is that you don't think Göbekli Tepe is a mystery.
No, not at all.
In a sense, there's a lot of very firm things we can say about the site. We can talk about when it was built. We have some radiocarbon dates. We have stylistic dates for the stone structures. We have stylistic dates for the stone pallets. Pallets, was that what they were? The slabs. We have stylistic dates for the stone tools. At the same time, we have a very clear sense that this iconography, well, first of all, the structure itself has parallels throughout the region right now, both in the valleys and with other large structures that have been found since, including one that was found before Göbekli Tepe was found. And at the same time, we have parallels for the iconography throughout the region. It's very similar to iconography throughout even larger region, right? Yeah. And then finally, what they're eating is also very paralleled across the region. Gazelle, wild grains and whatnot. And we have, in terms of food consumption, a huge amount of evidence for it. Thousands of animal bone remains. We have all the phytoliths that were studied, and then 700 querns that were published by Laura Dietrich and yourself and others. And so, in a sense, we have a very clear idea of the sort of what they're eating, when they're there, and how they're gathering together in feasts in this sort of ritual area, right? Is that what I'm hearing? That this is not a mystery, that there's a lot we can say for reasonably sure?
A very interesting and pretty cool site. Yes, a mystery? No, not at all. I mean, a mystery is something you just don't understand, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're going into the evidence, we're excavating new sources and resources to get some arguments to answer these questions, to make this a not mystery, to understand what's happening there. So yeah, this is basically what archaeology is about.
And I mean, since the very first book about this, it was full of citations and comparanda that described how this site was contextualized within the archaeological record nearby and further away.
Of course, without context, this wouldn't make much sense, but this is what archaeology is about, to reconstruct the context. A single object doesn't help us at all. So it may look nice in a museum glass case, but the real answer comes from the surroundings of these objects, from the context. And this is what we're going to do in archaeology.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. I think I have a better sense of the site, so I really want to thank you. Is there anything else you want to share about the site or the project or anything?
Well, there's a lot of resources online. Just look them up. We even try to get away from only publishing in academic circles.
Wait a second. I'm hoping that with you, we can put together a bibliography that'll be available below.
That would be great.
For people to, some will be scholarly articles that are available, open access. Others will be sort of writings for the general public or videos or things like that. So we will definitely provide that for people that are interested below, so they have resources where they can go.
Perfect. And this is just make your own picture. Just read up a bit on these mysteries and riddles, and you will see it's pretty cool stuff, but it's far from being a mystery.
Well, thank you so much, Jens. This was a very successful first conversations about super civilizations, and the pre-pottery Neolithic is pretty awesome.
It is, definitely. Thanks for having me.
Great.